How did you start? How did you get into this Egyptology? Why Egypt and just your journey in general?
I think it all came back to what I would call morbid curiosity as a 7 or 8 year old. When I joined the local public library, started sort of looking around various sorts of books, found these books with skeletons in them, which turned out to be books on archaeology, which then sort of fairly rapidly moved from just being interested in archaeology into Egyptology. Then when it came to, which was always then a hobby, I actually wrote my first academic article. I was still at high school, which was published just after I started university. But then it was a question of what do I do at university? Do I do something which I enjoy, or do I do something which might be useful? Computer studies or IT or whatever. And I decided I'd do what I was interested in, and eventually ended up with 3 degrees in archaeology and in Egyptology. Ended up having a day job for 25 years while teaching part-time at local university. And then when I managed to finally escape from the day job, which was a government civil service one, I then got back into full-time Egyptology about 12 years ago. Got made an honorary full professor back in 2018. And that's sort of where I've ended up. Although, interestingly, in parallel with my Egyptological career, over the last sort of 10 years, I've also got heavily involved in modern naval history research, which is another childhood interest. So at the moment, I've normally got 1 or 2 books on the go simultaneously, one of which is normally Egyptology and one of which is naval history. In fact, at the moment, I've theoretically got 5 books on the go at once, of which one is naval and the rest are all Egyptian to some greater or lesser degree.
How long have you spent in Egypt excavating and doing all
I've
this
never
work?
actually dug in Egypt. I'm not a particularly good person with down an archaeological trench. I did practical archaeology when I was a student in the UK and found I wasn't very good at it. Where I did find my interests in was dealing with material which had been previously excavated, analysing that, putting these things into a broader context. And so I'd probably say I sort of dig in museum basements and in archives rather than actually in the field. But I've spent a lot of time in Egypt. I've probably spent, on aggregate over my life, 3 or 4 years, I suppose, split up in various periods. The longest one was back in 2013 when I was visiting professor at the American University in Cairo for a semester. So I was based in Cairo for 4 months. So I think if I totted up all the various journeys I've made, and I've probably been to Egypt 80 or 90 times over the years, if not more. It probably sort of comes to a number of years, let's say, built up over various periods.
And what does it take to become a good at archaeology and at excavating? And why did you not have those skills?
I think to be a field archaeologist, you've got to be quite good working with a trowel. You've got to be good. It's working with sort of sections, all those sort of things. They require a certain amount of physical aptitude to do that properly, and that kind of raw level of archaeology I don't find particularly interesting. It is interesting, it's important, but not in the sense of doing it, if you know what I mean. I recognise but sitting there for a couple of hours drawing a section, which has been cut through in archaeology. Yeah, all very well, but it's not sort of my thing. Also, I've got a bad leg, which makes actually the physical crouching in the bottom of trenches also slightly problematic. So there's a certain amount of a physical thing where I'm not particularly physically comfortable in that, but also I'm not very good at it either. So those are my but what I had rapidly found I was particularly interested in, particularly post-excavation stuff, looking at material which had come to a museum perhaps 150 years ago, but never been properly analysed. And also, say, working through archives, looking at what one can make out of that archival material, which in some ways is almost archaeology in its own right. It's just that we are digging it up from an archive rather than than sort of from the ground. And that's sort of the archival stuff is one of the things where my naval history interests come in. I spend a lot of time at the British National Archives working through various official documents and so on. So that's sort of where I've ended up. So probably, although my title is Professor of Egyptology, I'm much more of a general historian in many ways nowadays. So particularly on sort of on the naval side, but also one of my current Egyptian projects also involves looking at the history of a Scottish dukedom as well. So yeah, I think a lot of scholars, they either become increasingly specialised as their time goes by, or wider. And so certainly in my university, although I do teach some stuff to do with ancient Egypt, I also deal with local history in Bristol, the history of the Second World War, the archaeology of the Second World War in the Bristol area. So yeah, I do quite a lot of different bits and pieces.
And are those materials you mentioned, like previously excavated ones, are they more available in Egypt, or do you have access to them in UK or in any other part of the
Most of the
world?
stuff I've dealt with in collections tends to be in the UK, simply for convenience purposes, but also the fact that there is a lot. In the 19th century, a lot of material was brought back by travellers, almost sort of tourists. People would bring back a coffin almost as a tourist souvenir. And therefore, a lot of museums, particularly some of the local ones, ended up having bits of Egyptian material donated to them, not because that's what the museum was really doing, but because a local person had given them this stuff. And it's that stuff, because they've gone to museums which don't actually currently have any kind of Egyptological staff, that their Egyptian material has often been overlooked. Therefore, one of the things I quite liked, I find interesting, is to actually try and sort of bring some of this completely ignored stuff back to visibility. For example, some of this material will never have been on display because may have a couple of Egyptian coffins and a couple of mummies in a small museum, but that's never been something they've. It's a local museum about local history and so on. So therefore, bringing some of this stuff to the light, at least insofar as them being able to publish it, I've currently got a website which is publishing an ongoing project to catalogue the Egyptian coffins in provincial collections around the UK, and particularly in the southwest where I'm based. It's one of those projects which, as usual, I thought it would take 10 years. It's been going for the best part of 25, and it's only a tiny bit of it done. But it's one of the things where the availability of being able to publish stuff online has been useful, because otherwise this stuff would just simply be in notebooks awaiting a full print publication, which may or may not come. However, because I've been able to do with this is, as I've finished a chapter on a given museum, I've then been able to then put that onto the website, and so that material is available to be downloaded. So,
And how do you analyze those materials? What's the process?
I
How
think
long does it take?
there's two sides to it. One is the history of the object itself, like how did it actually manage to get to where it is today? Who was involved in its acquisition? There's a very interesting one, which it turns out was acquired by one of the members of the Singer sewing machine family. And that sort of there's a story about why American Singer sewing machine people are living in southwest England. So I say, as I've become more and more of a general historian, there's always that side of what's the modern history of this thing. Then the next thing to do is to try and work out if we know where it came from, because half the time all we know is it came from Egypt, in the sense that that's if somebody brought it back, gave it to the museum, saying, "Hey, my uncle or grandfather acquired this in Egypt." But then look at the thing. Can you work out where it might have come from? Because certain periods, particularly coffins, the styles vary from location to location, and so you can probably work out where it came from on the basis of the way it's been decorated, which then sort of has synergy with the other part of the analysis, which is look at the iconography. What depictions of deities are on there? What are the texts which accompany it? All those kinds of things, which then can tell you something about where it came from. It can also help date it, because, again, some of these things have got no indication of where they were found or anything else. But again, on style, you can work out where they are. Then the other end of it, of course, is to look at what we can say about the person who owned it, because normally there will be the name of the dead person on it. Is this somebody who we know about from other sources, or is this the only thing we know about them? What are their titles? What might their job have been? So that's the basic package, if you like, that I try and put together when I'm working on a given object. So certainly the way I would work on with this coffin project, anyway.
Right. And what about deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics? Like, what's the process? Did it change over time, or is it like language, or is it
It
more
is, yeah.
general?
It's basically language. It's basically like learning any other foreign language. The only problem is, of course, you can't talk to anybody who actually speaks it because, well, you can to some degree, in the sense that the very latest form of the ancient Egyptian language is still used in liturgy in Coptic churches. But no, I don't think, apart from a few enthusiasts, you can't have a conversation with somebody in Coptic. Um, but basically, no, it's fundamentally, it is a straightforward language, say, which still survives in sort of a very niche use in Egyptian churches. The hieroglyphs themselves are simply representations of sounds and syllables. There's a few of them which have pictorial use, but the vast majority are either single letters or groups of 2 or 3 letters. The language itself changes over time, inevitably, because it's a language which survives for over 3,000 years, even before you get to the version which is available in churches today. But it certainly, in sort of IT terms, it's backwards compatible. Certainly, if you can read the late form of it, you can read the earlier stuff, because basically what happens is that the writings become more elaborate. They start writing in things that are only assumed on earlier phases. So something like Cleopatra VII, that's the famous Cleopatra in 30 BC. She could quite happily go to one of the pyramid sites. The pyramids built 2,500 years prior to her, because an interesting thing is that for Cleopatra, the pyramids are older than Cleopatra is for us. So, but she could perfectly happily go to some of the tombs around the pyramids, the contemporary ones, and read the texts. It wouldn't be possible, probably, for somebody who built the Great Pyramid to go to Cleopatra's era and read the text, because things had been changed, things had been added. But she would be able to look and see where things which as Egyptian was written in her day would have it, they're missing, but she can work out where they would be. And that's generally how when you learn ancient Egyptian at university, is you start with a later form of the language. In fact, what you do is you learn the middle form of the language, what we call Middle Egyptian, which therefore, as that's the most sort of common version, and even long after that ceased to be the form which was in the spoken word, it was what you would normally put on temple walls and things. So you learn Middle Egyptian, and then from that you can then work back to learn Old Egyptian, Late Egyptian, and further on like that.
How was the first deciphering made? Like the first
The first
person?
decipherment was done because there were various theories about how Egyptian should be deciphered, and one of the key ones was it the case that the hieroglyphs were writing the same language fundamentally as you now have in Egyptian in churches? That was the question. There was always two questions: what did each of the signs actually sound like? But what language were they writing? And the problem was you couldn't actually prove it one way or the other. However, in 1798, a slab of stone was found at Rosetta in northern Egypt, which had the same text in hieroglyphic Egyptian, demotic Egyptian, demotic being a handwritten version of hieroglyphs, which look nothing like the pictures that the hieroglyphs are, but they're the same size, and also in Greek. And the Greek, of course, could be read very easily, and therefore you could actually check any theories about how you're going to translate the hieroglyphic or demotic, because you knew what the answer was. Then, and also what was useful in all of that was the fact that in the Greek form, there were various royal names, particularly Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, and it had been suggested many years previously that some little ovals known as cartouches in the Egyptian text surrounded royal names. So what they were able to do is look at that and say, well, if that's right, that must be a P, that must be a T, and so on. A little bit later on, another inscription was found which shows you the name Cleopatra, which was there in Greek and also in Egyptian. So gradually it was possible to work out what the individual signs, what their sound was. And if you then applied the rules of the Coptic language, which is this very late version of the ancient Egyptian language, to that, you were then starting to get some useful translations out of it, which actually worked when you compared them with the Greek. And I think it's like any sort of code breaking. Once you've actually got a few bits of it readable, then it moves on. So in 1822, the basic concepts of translation were published by Jean-François Champollion, who was the man who was responsible for this. But it wasn't actually possible to actually be able to read a whole text for another 30-odd years. It wasn't until the 1850s that you could actually simply sit down and read something. Because in the interim, it was a question of adding on little bits and pieces of knowledge. If that assumption was correct, well, you could move on to the next bit. So, say, for the first sort of 20, 30 years after decipherment, you could read Egyptian, you could read royal names, you could read some phrases, you could even read a few sentences. You probably couldn't get a reasonable idea about the whole sort of spread of the text. But then by the 1850s, you had got to that point, and really since the 1850s, all Egyptologists do is simply read a text. It's not a question of decipherment per se. It's no more decipherment than somebody who actually knows Georgian to read a Georgian text. It's as simple as it's basically as straightforward as that nowadays. The problem mainly comes when you've got texture broken, because of course, coming from archaeological sites, things are often been so it's very rare that you've actually got a complete text in front of you undamaged. And a lot of the skill there comes in where there is a gap, trying to work out what might be in that gap so you can actually make some kind of coherent translation rather than just sort of a bit then. But again, we've got to the point where we understand the Egyptian ways of writing, because there's a lot of things they tend to say, they use the same sort of phrase time and time again, this sort of stereotype way of doing it. So again, from that, you're able to then work out, okay, that probably is what is in the gap there. So, and in fact, when I was talking about sort of digging in museum basements, where you've got broken text, sometimes if they've come out in the 19th century, different museums will have different parts of the same text. So it's often quite fun trying to spot something that's in Berlin, which happens to be the next sentence of something which is in Turin or somewhere like that. And that's quite an and then certainly where sort of the world of sort of online databases and so on have allowed people to sort of recognise this. You can actually start looking through museum catalogues, photographs, and so on to do that. But that's another part of the interest of trying to do this kind of jigsaw puzzle. And it's not just simply inscriptions, where of course that gives you a bit more information, but also other objects where it might turn out that one part of a coffin is in one museum, the other part is somewhere else, the outer one is, and so on. So that's that kind of detective work of trying to track down missing objects. It's again something which I find particularly fascinating.
And when you mentioned like Rosetta Stone and some other texts that were in Egyptian and then in Greek, how did you know that it was the same exact text in those two languages?
The Greek text says it is. It's basically it's a tax decree, basically. Rosetta Stone. It's nothing particularly exotic. But no, it basically says, and it was decreed that this decree should be erected in all temples of Egypt in these three languages. So it was absolutely clear it was the same thing.
And is the like grammatical structure similar to ours?
It's got quite a lot of common in Arabic. with Arabic, Arabic and Hebrew, for example. So certainly an Egyptian student learning ancient Egyptian finds it far easier than British or German or whatever student, because he or she will recognize some of the way that the language hangs together. It's part of the same language family as Arabic and Hebrew, although quite a long way, their ancestry is sort of thousands of years previously, but the basic way the language works, the way that pronouns work, those kinds of things would be something which is familiar to, say, an Arabic speaking student, whereas somebody who is been brought up in European languages, even if they've done Latin and Greek and things like you've got to start from scratch in understanding this is a language works a completely different way in the question of word order and stuff like that.
All right. So the one of the biggest questions I have and I'm most interested in is the building of Great Pyramids, and I'm sure it's like one of the most common questions. And like when I read the like maybe some theories about it, maybe less scientific ones, like there are many things from like an ancient lost civilization to aliens building them. So like I want to hear what do we know scientifically? What are the facts and how were they built?
Right. In the sense of being able to know exactly how it was done, we have no idea, simply because we just don't have the material to do so. All we can do is look at the pyramids and look at what we know about how the Egyptians went about stuff. We know that the use of ramps was something which was a key part, because they didn't have anything in the way of other lifting technology. But we certainly have examples of some unfinished pyramids which have still got the ramps in place. And we've also got ramps in various unfinished temples and so on. So we know that, and we've also even got a papyrus whereby you can calculate the optimum angle of a ramp for dragging stuff up it. So we know that's the basic concept, is that you move stuff around.
And how can they use ramps to move such heavy objects to such height?
Well, I think if you get it's a question of getting the elevate angle right. This is the point. So you may actually need some very, very long ramps to get that angle correct to it. But so we actually have a couple of pyramids, unfinished ones, with the ramps still in place. So we know they used ramps to build them. There's no question about that. We've also got a certain amount of data to do with the quarrying process. Quite a few blocks from a number of different pyramids have quarry marks on them, which often are the name of the king in question, the date, and the name of the construction crew who are working on it. So we can tell that that the organization was there were teams who were doing this, who were doing this kind of thing. We also know about the supply of sort of what you might call more exotic stones, because the majority of the stones which are used for building the pyramids are quarried within 1,000 meters of the actual pyramid themselves. Because at Giza, well, in the Great Pyramid, when you go there now, you see there are great sort of hollows in the ground. Well, you realise very rapidly that those hollows in the ground are all the stones which are actually piled up on top of each other on the pyramids. So, but also that stone is not particularly high quality. It's full of fossils, and so therefore, for the casing of the exterior of the pyramids, they brought in stone from the other side of the Nile, near Cairo Airport. There is a quarry which produces beautiful white, shiny limestone. And about 10, 15 years ago, they found a logbook for a boat.
How far is it from the like Great Pyramids?
It's on the other side of the river, so it's probably about a kilometre or so from the river, and then the pyramid. Well, it depends, because also what we know is that they built canals close to the desert edge, so you weren't having to bring stone down to the river, across the river, and then across a lot of land. The canals. So as a crow flies, perhaps 3 or 4 kilometres. But the point is, most of that is going to be on a boat. And we've got the logbooks, so we can actually tell how the deliveries of this kind of stuff worked as well. And also, we have also got the barracks in which the workmen were put up, where they lived during the construction process as well. So, although we can't say this is, exactly how it worked, we've got we've got the basic picture of how the process works, and so we've actually got examples of unfinished pyramids with the ramp still in place, with tools and so on found around them as well. So it's all it is. It just the fundamental thing about building a pyramid is it requires skill and physical strength. And I think when you look at the evolution of the pyramids from the very first pyramid to the really big ones, you can see there is a definite organizational and technological progress, because the earliest surviving pyramid has the stone blocks only the size of a mud brick, which is what they've been building things with previously. But then what you find in the next century or so before they start building the really big pyramids is in each generation, the pit blocks get bigger. So what's happened clearly is that the engineers are becoming more and more confident with their technology. And eventually they feel comfortable in building something really, really, really big, using sort of much larger stones, because they've, over the last 100 years, they know how to do it. And I think when it's anything to do with, when you talk about people in, if it's in industry or making anything, there's a lot to do with experience of doing it. And the longer you've been doing it, the better you are at it. And this is obviously generation. And also the other thing to bear in mind is in Egypt, jobs tended to be hereditary. So therefore, if your dad was a pyramid builder, you were. Your granddad probably was as well. And so a son of a pyramid builder, probably as soon as he could toddle, would probably go and spend some time watching his dad and his mates working. And that's how you build up the skills. There's nothing to do with that. You don't have a handbook to how to build a pyramid. What you do is watch your dad and his mates building a pyramid. And therefore, and when you've had generations of that, there's all sorts of bits of know-how which nobody's ever written down. It's because that you know that you sort of whack that block in a certain way to make it do something or other. You understand the fundamental difference between sort of 1 degrees on the ramp make all that difference. So I think that's the secret of pyramid building. It's organisation, accretion of skills over generations, and and also you can very clearly see there's an evolution in the way that they build pyramids, showing that as they're getting more and more confidence up to building the very biggest ones. And interestingly, once they've built the very biggest ones, they start going smaller, because I think they've made a point. I think there's probably they probably got, when the Great Pyramid, I think probably it's the biggest thing you can probably build given space, because also a question of having enough space to build the thing, because you've got to have decent bedrock to be able to build the foundations and stuff like that. And also, after they build the Great Pyramid, there comes a greater emphasis, not so much on the massiveness of the pyramid itself, but on the other buildings around it, because a pyramid doesn't stand alone. There's always a temple attached to it, which is for the offerings to be made to the spirit of the dead king. And what we can then graph very nicely is that once you've got to the biggest pyramid, then as you then move down, the pyramid gets smaller, but the temple gets bigger. So what they're doing, it's clearly they're deciding to change the emphasis on where the resources are going into. So rather than everybody trying to build a gigantic pyramid, what you're then trying to do is build a more modest pyramid with the most beautiful temple. And again, the Great Pyramid has quite a small temple attached to it with minimal decoration. But a few generations on, you've got a pyramid only a quarter of the size, but with a temple 3 or 4 times the size of the Great Pyramid's temple, with every wall covered in beautiful carvings, with statues around the temple. So it's all one has to look at the whole sort of story put together.
What about the mathematical part? Like what I read and listened to was like there are many different ratios in the pyramid that coincide with like diameter of Earth and those kind of things.
Yeah, I always think that this is all complete nonsense, because why would you? The first question is, okay, the main thing is there are so many, when you've got any kind of geometric element, you can analyze all sorts. You can almost any ratio you like, depending whether you want to try the angle of the exterior, sloping passage. So whatever you do, you could probably come up with some kind of numbers. But why would they bother? What is the point? Because unless you've actually got the ability to measure these things to some nth degree, you're not going to know there are these funny ratios. And also, if you're not, unless you're a mathematician, who cares? So what if it's the a certain number which we now know is the 1/60th of the diameter of Jupiter on a Wednesday? Who cares? Why should anybody care? Now, if you've got some information to impart, the Egyptians were perfectly able to write it all down in hieroglyphs. So why have these? So I just can't see the point of these exotic numbers. They may exist if you do the sums, but what's the point of it? If you can only reveal it if you're able to survey these things to nth degree. But no, why is anybody ever going to do that? And this is half the problem I find with some of the more exotic ideas, is what's the point? Why would anybody want to do this? And nobody's ever gives me but isn't it cool that they've got these ratios? Is it? I'm not a mathematician. I don't really,
So
what's the
you're
point?
saying it's just a coincidence that
I think it's a purely
ratios
coincidence, because half the time is that for every measurement or ratio, which apparently is something deep and meaningful, they haven't bothered measuring a whole load of other ones, which apparently mean nothing at all. So I think that's part of the question is, it's always these kinds of ideas about exotic explanation of things are normally very, very subjective. They'll pick on 3 measurements or ratios which sound like they're interesting, but then ignore the rest which aren't. And again, the bottom line is, why bother? What is the point of any of this?
maybe we don't know what the point is, and
Well,
they did.
in that case, the thing is, why should we actually assume there is a point? It's only because as far as we know, the Egyptians had no interest in theoretical mathematics. They were interested in practical mathematics, things like, what angle do you need to build a ramp to be able to move X up it and things like that. So they had quite good maths from the point of view of practical stuff about day-to-day stuff, but there's no evidence that they had any interest in sort of theoretical mathematics. I think the Mesopotamians seem to have had a bit more interest in that sort of thing there, the Babylonians, the Syrians, but there's no evidence that the Egyptians had any interest in mathematics other than what you might call applied mathematics in our terms.
And so what is the purpose of pyramids?
It's simply it's the monumental element of a royal tomb. Quite what the pyramid means, why they've gone for that, is a matter of debate. The most sort of simple one is that prior to modern times, the only way to build a very tall but stable monument is a pyramid. You can't know that until you've got, you can't just build it requires reinforced concrete and things to build skyscrapers or whatever. So if you want something as tall as the Great Pyramid, the only way you're going to make something as tall as that is by using a pyramid as the shape. There is no other way you can do it unless you've got reinforced concrete. So first of all, it could just simply they want to build something which is tall and impressive. The other option, which possibly isn't inconsistent with that, is that we know that the fetish of the sun god was either a pyramidal or a conical stone. And we think, they haven't wanted to write this down, but it's possible that the idea of this fetish of the sun god being a cone or a pyramid is because that the pyramid is the petrified rays of the sun. And in fact, if you're up at a pyramid site on a cloudy day and you see the sun breaking through the clouds, it comes through as a cone of light, pretty well the same angle, it's that typical angle of a pyramid, and something which could support the idea that the pyramid is some kind of solar symbol, is that around the time that they start building pointed pyramids, because there were also step pyramids before that, when they moved to the pointed version, that's exactly the point in time where royal names start incorporating the name of the sun god. Previously, there hadn't been a regular thing. But once you start building pointed pyramids, pretty well every king has the sun god Re in his name. So that is suggestive that the transition to true pyramids, pointed pyramids, is because they want to make the pyramid a solar symbol. Again, we can't prove any of that, but but looking at it from the point of view of how you work in archaeology, you see you look at what's happening simultaneously, and it makes some sense. I wouldn't say that's the truth. However, it's a pretty good theory as to what the pyramid means and why they start building the pyramid at that particular time.
And then there is another theory that Sphinx was built differently, and then the ancient Egyptians added the head of a pharaoh later.
That's an interesting one, because the Sphinx head is out of scale with the rest of it, and I have certainly suggested that it always had a pharaoh's head, but not necessarily the head which we've got at the moment. And this isn't a general accepted theory. It's simply something which I've put forward on a couple of occasions in the past, is that originally the head was rather larger, but because the stone is fairly poor, if you look at the way it's weathered, that over a number of centuries, the head the head had eroded to a greater or lesser degree, and therefore it was recarved at a smaller scale. And when that happened, might be about 500 years after the Sphinx was originally built. There's all the evidence suggests that the Sphinx is contemporary with the Giza pyramids, either Khafre, who built the pyramid whose temple is next door to it, or Khufu, who is a couple of reigns prior to that. However, when you look at the head of the Sphinx, the way in which the headdress is striped, and also the form of the face, doesn't really fit in with heads of royal statues of the period of the building of the Great Pyramid, the Great Pyramids. However, if we jump forward 500 years or so to the reign of a king called Amenemhat II, we do actually find a Sphinx of that king with a very similar face and the same very unusual striping of the headdress. So I have suggested that the head may have been recarved by Amenemhat II. And we know that the Sphinx had been under restoration on various occasions over the centuries. With the paws, for example, they're now made up largely of stone blocks, some which are actually from modern restoration, but some go back to Roman or earlier times. So the Sphinx has clearly undergone restoration, and I strongly suspect that the head was redone, say, about 500 years or so after its original carving. But again, one can't prove any of that, because all one can do is just look at what we've got in front of us, because there are no written records. But say the very fact that the only other carved head which looks like that, including the quite sunken eyes, the way the striping is done, is this other Sphinx belonging to Amenemhat II. Unless, of course, Amenemhat II is copying the Giza Sphinx for making this one of his own. That's the other option. But we can't retell these things particularly well at all. But let's say we know there's an ongoing restoration of the Sphinx over the millennia, and I think this is probably just a manifestation of that one.
And the body of a sphinx is a lion, right?
It's a lion, yeah. Sphinx,
Why
yes.
is it a lion?
Basically, the Sphinx is a typical way of representing the king, which we find going throughout Egyptian history. And the idea is that the lion is a powerful, brave creature, and that is a sort of creature that the king should aspire to. The bull is another one where is another animal who's associated with kingship, and therefore depicting a king as a sphinx is a really good way of depicting him as a powerful, brave creature. Also, I think artistically, sphinxes are really quite nice, work very well as being the guardians of a tomb, a temple, or whatever. So you've got the Great Sphinx is sitting there right at the entrance, effectively, to the Giza plateau, almost as it's almost its guard cat almost. But also in many temples, the approaches to Egyptian temples are normally often have sphinxes, avenues of sphinxes running up to them. At Luxor, for example, there is this sort of 2.5 kilometer one leading between the Karnak and Luxor temples, completely lined with sphinxes. And that's probably most spectacular. Pretty well every temple has at least a pair of sphinxes guarding it, but in some cases, so you may have a kilometer or more of these things. So I think we understand what the Sphinx is very much, and it's just that the Giza one is sort of the biggest and one of the earliest of them to survive.
And how does Egyptian religion, their deities, how do they compare to, let's say, Greek, personality-wise, mythology-wise, or
Yeah.
in general?
Yeah. The one thing about the Egyptian religion is it isn't as systematized as the Greek and Roman one. In Greek and Roman religion, it's quite clear which gods are the father, mother, and whatever of the other various deities, and also they generally have fairly well-defined functions. In Egypt, it's all rather more free form. There certainly was sort of a standard mythology in various locations about how the gods were related to each other. That didn't necessarily apply across the whole of Egypt. So a god might be the son of a particular goddess in one city, but maybe her husband or even her father somewhere else. And it seems that the Egyptians had there was no idea of that being a sort of a systematic religion. There was no kind of doctrine or anything like that. And I think probably partly because of the way that the Egyptian religion has come together in the first place, which is back in prehistoric times, there was gods around the country. And as the country eventually became unified, there was no attempt at the reunification to then try and unify the way that the gods were being looked at. So what you end up with is various different traditions in different locations as to who was related to who. And even as far as what people's roles were, some gods certainly had some kind of sort of day job, if you want to call it that. But that wasn't their sole purpose. They weren't necessarily the god of X. They were probably the guardian god of a certain city, and they had some responsibilities in other areas. For example, Ptah was the god of Memphis, which was the capital of Egypt for most of ancient history, but he was also a patron god of craftsmen. Then you've got Hathor, who is who is a goddess who is found sort of throughout Egypt, but is almost a goddess of being a woman, almost a goddess of femininity, rather than having any specific roles. But it's all there's some, and depending on where you are, some gods have major roles. Some are just simply, as far as we can tell, nothing more than just local forms of a god. So it's a very sort of unsystematic sort of thing. And although you had gods who benefited from state state-funded cults. Others were much more sort of household gods. So there would be the major gods who had the big temples, but actually, if you were in your house, you might have a small shrine to completely different deities who mattered something to you. For example, certainly in households, you'd often have two minor deities called Bez and Taweret, who were protectors of the house and also protectors of women in pregnancy and childbirth. So therefore, gods who really matter to your personal thing may be different gods to gods who matter at a sort of cosmic or national kind of level. And in various texts, it's very clear that people had their sort of own personal religion was quite important to them. Who could offer some texts talk about your God. So it's often saying, which God you feel affiliation with, which God do you, probably one of you from your town is somebody you might pray to in times of trouble. It's who you want. It's about how you want to do it. It's quite the completely opposite sort of the doctrines of the church or Islam or so on and so. It's a much more almost anarchic kind of religion.
Right. And you mentioned the builders that there was that you found the barracks of the builders of the pyramids. How did they look, and what do they tell us about their life and their work life?
They're fairly well ruined, of course, but they look in the form of they're very much barracks. So therefore, you've got rooms which are effectively dormitories where they live. Then you've also got bakeries and other sort of cooking facilities. So they're clearly centrally catered. And looking at the numbers involved, what it does tell us is that you've got that in the building of a pyramid, or probably any other sort of major monument, you've got two different sorts of workers. You've got the permanent hardcore of skilled people, and these are the people I'm talking about who've been doing it for generations. But also, what you've probably got is what you might call seasonal workers, because during the late summer, early autumn, the Nile floods, and all the fields get covered by the Nile flood. And so, therefore, the river effectively is right up to the edge of the desert where most of this building work is carried out. Now, this had two effects. One is that the farmers were unable to work their fields because their fields were under a number of meters of water, which would then drain away in the later autumn, and they could then start planting crops and so on. It also meant that getting barges of materials up to the edge of the desert was really easy because there was no worrying about canals because the whole of the Nile Valley was a lake. So therefore, during that time, there were people who were available for work who couldn't do anything else. It was easy to bring in material from outside. So probably during that later summer, early autumn, those farmers were probably then employed to, first of all, help bring materials which weren't available on the pyramid plateau. So the more exotic stones I was talking about, not only this limestone from the other side of the river, but also granite and other hard stones from hundreds of kilometers further from in the south. But also from the point of view of moving material which is being quarried on the site to holding areas for the skilled workers. So I think so again, we can't prove this, but the general theory anyway is that during that period of the inundation, the farmers would be redeployed as unskilled workers simply to help drag stone either from the quayside, which is stuff has been brought from outside, or from the quarries near the pyramids to areas. So therefore it was all available so that when the water went down and they went back to their farms, the skilled labourers, ones who were actually living on site, would then be able to put all that stuff in place through until the next time when these people were available. So it's very much you've got a government run community. They've even got their own, and even the workman's village here also has its own cemetery as well. And it's very stratified. At the top of the hill, you've got big tombs belonging to the overseers. At the bottom, you've got much smaller tombs belonging to the individual workmen. And the analysis of some of the skeletons they've found have shown these people were, skeletal changes from having done a lot of hard labour. They were doing that. And interesting, we've also got barracks from later on as well, for building some one of the later pyramids, and also then more accommodation for the people who were building the Valley of the Kings tombs over 1,000 years later. So it's quite clear that there is this always a state-sponsored community of royal tomb builders. And certainly when we look at the one where we've actually got text evidence for this one 1,000 years later, the people building the Valley of the Kings, it's families going on for generation after generation after generation, learning the skills of tomb building, whether it be pyramids construction in the early time or the cutting and decoration of Valley of the Kings tombs much later.
So they were not slaves; they were just hired workers who were.
Yeah. Certainly the permanent staff would certainly have been skilled workers. They weren't. Whether the problem is, of course, that our terminology of what we mean by slave, is that generally speaking, in pre-modern times, you didn't change your job very often. In the sense that in Europe before industrialization, everybody worked on the land. They had no other option but doing so. They were paid in kind or in money or whatever. So, but in the sense of people who are being forced to work and are not getting any recognition and so on, they're not slaves. The conscription of farmers during the inundation could be regarded as a bit more near close to slavery. But again, these aren't people who aren't bonded labour. But it's always a problem that using the term slave in a pre-modern context is always a very difficult one. If you think about looking at European history, we use the term serfs in Russia before the emancipation, except the fact that they were native Russians rather than imported Africans. Their situation was not much different from the slaves, quote unquote, in North America. So, we sort of tend to. There's a question of loading here, depending on what word you use. But I think in the terms of slaves as being people who are being forced to work, the pyramids are not built by slaves. They're built by people who probably have not even a dream of doing anything else, but they are well fed, well paid, and they're recognised as people who have got skills which need to be nurtured.
What are the biggest misconceptions about Egypt and maybe history in general that irritate you the most?
It's a lot. It's probably a long list of those sorts of things. I think part of it is the failure to understand how history, and particularly ancient Egyptian history, is created. When you go to school, history is sort of taught as being a narrative which is certain. Okay, there may be debates over motivations and detail, but the basic picture, the existence of various historical figures and so on, is all fine. The trouble is when you get back into ancient Egypt, the ancient world in general, the pre-Roman and pre-Greek world, shall we say 400 or 500 BC, is that the question about even basic facts and structure are a matter of debate, and even the existence of certain people. Now, we've discovered that certain people who we thought existed turned out to be spelling mistakes, effectively, and we've also had situations where somebody we thought was a man turned out to be a woman once as more evidence came in. And I think that I find people incredulous that sort of fundamental change can happen. Also to do with chronology, about when things happened, how long things occurred. And people quite happily quote back to me a book on ancient Egyptian history written in the 1920s as apparently authoritative, but actually almost everything has changed because every new discovery can make a difference. Sometimes it's not immediately obvious a huge difference, but actually, as these things add up, they can lead to change, fundamental changes in history. And certainly, even during my career, I did a new edition of one of my books only less than 10 years after the first one, and new discoveries meant 75% of my narrative had to be changed. Not vastly, but significantly. And if you compare something which I've written on a given period of Egyptian history with something written 50 years ago, they're almost unrecognizable. And that's, I think, my biggest problem is people don't understand that history is actually a movable thing, and you can't just simply say that's it. And also understanding how far certain things are assumptions, working hypotheses, and so on. Like when you get people who start trying to argue, what was the motivation of X to do Y? I would turn around and say, well, A, I'm not even sure X may not even have existed, or may have been two different people. And as to motivation, we have absolutely no idea, because we don't have the kind of people's diary. The reason why we can understand the motivation of certain more recent historical figures, we've got diaries, we've got contemporary people writing about them. In Egypt, we've just not got that. The nearest thing we've got to autobiography is statements on tomb walls about what one's career was and how wonderful you were. It's not in any way reflective at all. It's just simply a statement of your role in the world, which is something which you want to maintain in the next world. So I think that's my biggest, and I think that many of my other gripes about misunderstandings comes from that lack of understanding of what the nature of the writing of the archaeology and history of ancient Egypt is. It is something which is very much flexible, and all the time, really, we have to question what we have learned from our predecessors. Recently, it was agreed pretty well amongst people who kept dealing with the period to reverse the order of two pharaohs. They've been a certain way round since they were discovered when hieroglyphs were deciphered in the 1820s, and we'd always assumed you had this king followed by that king. And eventually it becoming more and more clear there's a problem that created various historical problems. And then somebody decided, what happens if we swap them round? And suddenly all the problems disappeared. Then the question was, well, why have we had them that way round for 200 years? And the answer was simply because somebody had guessed went round that way 200 years ago. There was no, when you went back to why they put them that way round, there was no explanation. It was simply, let's do it that way round. And I think that's one of the most important things, I think, for an Egyptologist or any historian, is always just to question where you're getting this stuff from. Test it all the time. And if you're not sure, and it's also, I think, why it's quite important to actually understand the history of your own subject. Because I'm writing a series of biographies I've been writing of various pharaohs. The final chapter is all about their rediscovery. And it's to try and actually go back to when we didn't know this person existed at all. How did we get to know that? And in that getting to know that, are there any points where we've made huge leaps of assumptions about them? Now, so is this the fact that I was taught at university about a given king? Was it ever a fact, or was it simply an assumption somebody made in the early 19th century? And there's also things in here to do with talk about motivation. There is a period where the pharaoh abolishes the existing Egyptian religion and creates a new one. Now, if you read a lot of history books, this is all part of a church-state conflict. That the king is by changing the religion, he's trying to reduce the power of the priests, etc., etc. But actually, if you look at the contemporary material, there is nothing which indicates that's what he was doing at all. All that the contemporary stuff has is he's having a religious revelation. But then you look back, well, where did the idea this is a church-state thing come from? Which go back to the 19th century, when historians and people writing on Egyptian history were normally trained in European history. These are people for whom the mechanisms of medieval and early modern history in Europe is the conflict between the Pope, the priests, the church, and the emperors and kings. So therefore, there's sort of an underlying assumption that if you've got something weird and wonderful happening religiously, and the king is asserting himself over in that, it must be part of a church-state conflict. When actually there is no evidence of that whatsoever. But it's become so ingrained in Egyptology that still people will explain this religious reform, this revolution, in those sorts of terms, without ever understanding that it ultimately comes back to this mindset of anybody who's ever worked with European history, that one of the main drivers of pre-modern, even modern history in Europe is a conflict between the church and the state. There is no separate church and state in ancient Egypt. The king is the head of all cults. So, but it gets I think it's a good example about understanding about how what we've got in front of us, which I always emphasise to people when I'm writing anything or even speaking. This is my working hypothesis about the way that whatever topic works. I'm not saying this is true. All I'm saying is, for me, it makes the best sense of the data I have in front of me.
And how was the church structured? How was the religion structured? What purpose did priests have?
Yeah, it was a fairly decentralized kind of organization, largely a question of in localities, and you would have in each temple you'd have a hierarchy of priests headed by a high priest, going down to various junior ones. However, in many smaller temples, the priesthood were not full time. They might, and what seems to have happened is that you would normally be the high priest. His day job might be a carpenter or some other kind of craftsman, but he would do a month of duty as high priest. And the other priest would also be that. And we've actually got some documents whereby one sort of month's shift of priest is handing over to the next one, and the others are signing for all the temple items. So you've got, I think, the majority probably of these of priesthoods were part-time. You might have one or two junior priests who were always there, but the high priest might well be a local army officer or whatever.
And what did it take to become a priest?
Very good question. We don't really to be a priest. You needed to shave all your body hair, which had to be pure. So that's in fact the underlying word for basic priest is wab, pure. Presumably, you had to have had a certain appropriate education. So you probably could read. You should be able to read and write. Because of that's I would have thought literacy, at least for the vast majority.
Was it common?
So you can, of course, just learn some of this stuff by rote. But there's a certain assumption there's probably some literacy involved, and probably that the majority of those education was probably in the hands of the temples. That the teaching of reading and writing was fundamentally done on that basis.
Was it common? Did a lot of people know how to read and write?
It's very difficult to know. It's often been reckoned about perhaps 4 or 5%. Probably, again, not dissimilar to the situation in most of the world, in most of the pre-modern world, where the people who could read and write are going to be, by definition, almost the ruling class. So there's going to be government officials, senior priests, all the ones who are going to be able to do that. And then you've probably also got people who worked as sort of collective scribes, in the sense that if somebody who was illiterate wanted a letter written, there would be a local scribe who would write that letter for them. So, which again, I think is the sort of thing which again you can find in pre-modern other parts of the world as well. So literacy is clearly is the key to being in in power. And there is a satirical document which is basically aimed at somebody who doesn't want to do his homework effectively, being told all the awful things which happen if you're anything other than a scribe. If you're a scribe, i.e., you can read and write, you can do all these things. Your job is fairly cushy. You can, you do your job sitting down, etc. But if you don't want to become a soldier, you can get beaten up, you can get killed, and there's a sort of a clear thing about the scribes being that. Just going back to just talking about priesthood, you've also, however, got the major state temples, which are clearly funded from the centre. But although a lot of the running costs of a temple would be borne by land attached to it, because there's no currency in ancient Egypt. Everything is effectively undone by barter and things. And so temples would have fields, farms endowed to them, which would then produce not only the food and drink necessary for offering to the gods, but also to feed the priesthood as well. So they become major landowners, and something like the major state gods, they will have owned chunks of land all over Egypt, which would have fundamentally then gone to pay for the running of the temple, paying the priesthood, feeding the priesthood, and so on.
What rituals did they have?
The basic idea of the rituals was to look after the god. Egyptian temples were not like churches or mosques for mass worship. What they were, would there be in the innermost sanctuary, there would be a statue of the god, and that the job of the priests would be to feed and clothe. So in the morning, the shrine would be opened, and the statue would be dressed for the day, and would be given its breakfast, in food and drink, which, as far as we can work out, would sit there for about 10 minutes for the god to take sustenance from it, at which point the rest would then be carted off to the kitchen to become the priest's breakfast. And then at each part of the day, there would be other sort of rituals of the god, having its clothes changed, some things said to it, and then at the end of the night, it would then be ready for the night, and the shrine would be closed until the morning when it would wake up. So the idea is the temples are the houses of the gods, and that they will, and as a result, and therefore they're treated very much like that. Also, that at certain times of the year in the great festivals, the statue of the god would be taken out of the temple and paraded around the town, possibly even taken over the other side of the Nile for a major festival. And that's really when ordinary people would be able to engage with the god in the temple. So they would be able to approach the god and ask it questions. And there was a sort of that people clearly it was sort of a major spectacle that people turned out to watch the procession go by. In some cases, there seems to have been some kind of sort of mythological plays put on during these festivals, whereby parts of the myths of the god would be reenacted. It's a bit like the mystery plays of medieval Europe, those sorts of ideas. And so that's where those. And that would be when the major gods. But as I say earlier on, that actually in people's houses there'd be a small shrine to their local god, who might be, say, like Bez and Taweret. I was talking about these household gods, but they might have a figure of one of the major gods, if that was a god who meant something to them. So I think that your relationship with the god as an individual was very much on a personal basis, rather than through some sort of collective acts of worship. You would perhaps sit down with the little figure of the household god and talk to it, pray to it, but expecting that, rather than say any sort of kind of collective worship as you find in Christianity or Judaism or Islam.
Well, were there any sets of prayers they would say, any like written or verbally remembered?
Not really, no. Well, we do have some prayers to specific deities, but but we certainly don't have what would be what you could see as any kind of sort of a full prayer book or anything. Or we've got odd things survive, which is the problem with anything to do with ancient Egypt, is that we have um a tiny fraction of what once existed as far as written and any other kind of any other kind of um, material is concerned. Um, so we have a few, if a bit of papyrus or an ostracon or something survives with a prayer on it, we've got that. We can't necessarily tell how sort of standardized that is. And the sorts of things are some of them are what we do have. There aren't simply praise ones, a little bit like a hymn, just saying, oh God, oh God, so and so, you're wonderful, you etc. etc. But other ones are very much asking questions, specifically asking for help in a particular manner. I say it comes down to this personal relationship with the, and so that the long form prayers tend to be the ones which seem to have been used in the major temples. Other ones are at much more of a personal kind of level about, I need help on this. And in fact, in addition to the gods, you could also address dead ancestors as well, which you might do through a spoken prayer, but also we know they wrote these things down. And so it was almost a written request as to, what you, can you help me with this and stuff like that.
How was their belief for the afterlife, and was the mummification process for everyone or only for pharaohs? And what purpose did it have? And like, it's a many questions, but in
Yeah.
general, how was
Right,
their, yeah.
in general terms, the idea, as far as we can tell, and this is the problem again, we're inferring this from what we see, is that the idea was that you then continued on with a life which looked remarkably like your life on Earth. That it was they didn't perceive the next world as being anything other than a bigger and better Egypt, as far as we can tell. As far as sort of attaining that, there is an it appears that you had to pass through various trials to be found fit to have eternal life, culminating in the weighing of your heart against the feather of truth. The heart was regarded as being the seat of intelligence and memory and so on. And that you got to a certain point in your heart, which is actually left in the body during mummification, one of the few organs which was placed on scales with against the feather of truth, because the goddess of truth, Ma'at, her symbol is a feather. And so therefore the idea is if your heart was as light as a feather, you were therefore a good person and could pass through into the next world. If you weren't, your heart was eaten by a monster, and it's not made quite clear what happens next. It suggests that that you sort of cease to exist, or you're left to wander sort of namelessly throughout eternity. As to how mummies fit in with all of this, again, no, they never bother telling us. But we do know that a human being had 5 components: one physical, and the other 4 spiritual. And there seems to be some indication that for a fully fulfilling afterlife, you need to have all 5 of those in existence. And therefore, the mummification is to ensure that the body, which is to say one of those 5, remains viable. But also, I think the idea of some kind of physical representation, because it seems that there's an implication, again not spelt out, that if the mummy is destroyed, a statue is sufficient. So there's some kind of likeness, and even actually, ultimately, providing your name survives, you can't be completely obliterated. So there's one Egyptian text which basically says, write a book and live forever, because people will always have your name in front of them. So that seems to be the conception going on. But again, they don't actually spell this out, and we've had to infer that from what we see. And so, for example, from the various guidebooks to the dead to being dead, which survive, most famously the Book of the Dead, which has various spells and so on for the well-being of the spirit in the next world, and also includes this scene of this weighing of the heart, which seems to be a fairly crucial part of the whole process.
And
I was just saying, who
yeah,
asked who had mummification? I think basically anybody could afford it. And it does seem that mummification gets cheaper as time goes by because people who, in some of the early periods, we simply just find skeletons, no sign of any wrappings or chemical treatment. Later on, people of a similar kind of social standing, we say they seem to have quite a mummification, nice coffin, and so on. So it looks as though there is a bit more sort of it becomes more generally available later on. There is an idea which you find in a lot of books about a democratization of the afterlife, whereby initially it's only for the elite, but then later everybody gets it. That I think is now being recognised as being rather an over-reading of the data, and it looks as though everybody was always able was able to live forever. It's just that the material we've got becomes more common as time goes on. Partly, I think, probably due to accidents of preservation, because as I say, a vast majority of the material is now long lost, and the further back in time you go, because we're talking about a 3,000-year period of history, and stuff which has survived from, I don't know, 2,500 years ago is fairly minimal, and therefore exponentially the further you go back, the more chance there is for things to have been destroyed, reused, or whatever. So by the time we're getting to this very early period where people have sort of suggested that afterlife was a royal thing only, that actually was based on very, very little data. It's only because the royal stuff is all that survives. We haven't got the kind of material relating to more to less exalted people from that early period as we have later on.
yeah. And so finally, do you think we'll ever have all the answers?
Absolutely, no, we never will do. I say part of the problem is, of course, so much is lost anyway. But almost every year we're finding a bit more. As I say, if you compare what's being written now with 50 years ago, we know massively more. But most of that was just done on an incremental kind of basis. So we'll never know everything. Hopefully, some of our most sort of obvious holes in our knowledge might be filled in. And that knowledge can be filled in by something quite spectacular being found, statue or whatever, or even just simply a graffiti. There's graffiti on a wall often is some of the way we find out most of our information, because there's no sort of spin on it. The danger with monumental stuff is it's always, what the establishment wants the world to know. But something which is a graffito written in a quarry, there's no spin on it. It's normally something happened on a certain day. And that's sometimes where we're able now to sort of realise, and those are ones which can change history overnight. Just knowing that somebody was a king's reign was slightly longer or later than we thought, that somebody who we thought had died in a certain point was still alive 10 years later, that can have some quite major impact. And that book I was talking about with the 75% of the pages changed just really came from the site discovering just one graffito in a quarry. But the knock-on effects of that new information meant that lots of things were subtly altered.
What percent of the history do we know, by your estimates?
No, we probably only know about a couple of about 5%, if that. Have useful working hypotheses on perhaps 25%. The rest of it is all great, is very much more in the way of working hypotheses which have got an awful lot of holes in them. I think probably that amount of certainty will gradually creep up, and the level of working hypotheses which are more accepted than others. Because for certain periods, there are as many different theories about what's going on as there are Egyptologists who work on that period. And there is one particular one I work on where we thought we got it all worked out back in the 1970s, what was going on. There are a few loose ends. Unfortunately, when people started pulling those loose ends, the whole thing came apart again. So we had a period of about 5 years where everybody was broadly agreeing about a certain period, and now there's almost as many different versions of that period as there are Egyptologists. Okay, for somebody from the outside, they wouldn't regard this as being sort of massive differences. But when you're actually in close into a subject, you know, what may, for say, to someone from the outside think that's a minor issue, it's actually quite important at sort of, you know, the specialist level. And I think that's another little thing when we're going back to sort of things which are, when one's trying to sort of engage about ancient Egypt with people, is quite understanding where some of us are coming from and why something which appears to be totally irrelevant actually is really important for you at that, you know, at that kind of level.
And all right, thank you for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I wish you all the best with your works and your books and your personal life.
Thank you for talking to me.